This time we watched Season 11, Episode 11.
And we already got one for the goof reel.
This time we watched Season 11, Episode 11, Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 11? No, 2.
A movie in which an older man takes his young ward to David Carradine's bar.
But first, some follow-up.
Ooh.
Devoted listener April from Pennsylvania writes, I've been watching all of the Star Trek series. Good on you, April. I took a break from DS9 Season 2 to rewatch MST's Wizards of the Lost Kingdom because you were going to talk about it next, and I needed a refresher. That is a very responsible listener.
Yes, please drink and drive. Wait, that's wrong.
But before listening to your podcast, I decided to watch one more DS9. I swear to you that the next episode I watched was the one with Rugal. And just for context, Rugal was played by the same actor who played the lead in the first Wizards of the Lost Kingdom. Holy crap, how weird to have you tie that MST movie to the very episode of DS9 I just happened to watch back to back with it. Obviously, Adam is monitoring my Netflix account to point out things I would never notice on my own. And because of that extra dedication to delivering meaningful and personalized content to your listeners, I will finally head over to your Patreon.
Yay! All right. So there's a lot there. Thank you very much, April. Yes, you and your loved ones can donate to the production of this show to make things a little easier for us and keep our production costs down by going to patreon.com/itsjustashow or itsjustashow.com/Patreon. And also, for April, I have been monitoring your Netflix account, and good on you for getting all those episodes of Glow done in such a short period of time. It's a great show, and everyone should watch. I will try my best to throw in as many Laurie Anderson references as you like, but sometimes it's cuckoo cold outside, and I can't. And what's more, we have another fun letter from devoted listener Chad from Seattle, who writes, as a kid of the early 1980s, I really appreciated your insight into what sparked the medieval cinema burst during the age of Reagan. It's interesting that, as the genre aged, it started skewering towards younger audiences, offering pre- and early teens the opportunity to take the hero's journey long before Harry Potter did. Well, an opportunity for boys, I should say. The medieval setting leaves little room for young women to have a leading role, and not at all for people of color, which doesn't work as well in today's more diverse global audience, that at least acknowledges that the hero's journey is not the sole property of young white men.
Hey, thank you for your letter, Chad.
Yeah.
And thanks to all our listeners out there. It's so great to hear from you.
Yes, we need your letters to live. I mean, I have a condition.
And this brings up a tricky point. We do tend to think, I think, just in popular culture, about medieval settings as being sort of naturally centering on boys, and especially on white boys. But of course, there were women and people of color in medieval Europe. So why is it we think that way?
Question, were the women just played by young boys, Beth, as was often the case in plays?
This started to develop in the 18th century when a couple of scholars got very interested in kind of tying geography to ethnicity and started getting really interested in tracking down what was known as the Teutonic race versus the Celtic race, which of course would be Ireland, Scots, the French, as being kind of distinct from the English race.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually, because it was just easier to do that, they just like, well, let's just combine these two, and this is basically the Europe race.
And wow, that would involve druids, which is strange because no one knows who they were or what they were doing.
Anyway, I should mention, if you want to learn more about this, again, there has been some really interesting articles on it. There's one from The Public Medievalist about racism, and the Middle Ages, and we'll have a link in our show notes.
Mm-hmm.
I almost said pubic medievalist.
And I'm sure there would have been plenty of merkins around.
All right, well, maybe we should go talk about this movie.
Well, you've put a spell on me with this opening, so I have no choice but to say yes.
This time we watched Season 11, Episode 11, Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2. The movie opens on a white-haired, cave-dwelling hermit named Caedmon, who is promptly summoned by a godlike being named Veneer to find the Chosen One and defeat 3 evil wizards. Caedmon dithers, noting that he is but a mere shepherd and the lowest of the wizards. But As we soon find out, Caedmon is the only good wizard left in the world, so he gets the Gandalf role by default. He eventually comes across the chosen one, Tyre, the lowly teenage son of a dirt farmer. Though reluctant to have him leave at first, Tyre's mom notes that it's gotta be better than pulling turnips. During a very long meanders through the woods, Caedmon begins to teach Tyre about magic, including transforming a turnip into a urinating turnip. They eventually decide to find another ally, the so-called Dark One, a great warrior who turns out to actually be a slumming David Carradine. But he's settled down as a barkeep with his table-dancing wife and has no desire to adventure further. So our heroes go on to defeat the first wizard themselves, rescuing 3 blondes and a hero named Ermon in the process. They also snag a pretty slick artifact called the Amulet of Light, which can turn baddies into stone. But they are not permitted to rest their laurels for long. Caedmon pushes them along to the caverns of Fënir, where they meet Amethea, the heavily feathered warrior princess, who should really be the hero of this movie. Instead, Tyre is practically prodded by a disembodied Vanir into breaking into the castle. There, Seductress attempts to seduce a horny Tyre into giving her the amulet, but he manages to resist. Or rather, Vanir tells him to resist and he obeys. Anywho, he gets a sword, the Dark One and his wife show up for the fight, and they move on to the final boss. Tyre wins all by using a magic spell to Popeye up his arm and gently toss his sword into his enemy's chest. The movie concludes with our puppet master Vanir ordering Amethea and Ermin to marry, and they're like, okay. While our 2 het couples make out, the May-December duo of Caedmon and Tyre head off into the sunset for their next adventure.
Meanwhile, on the Satellite of Love, it's raining? Yes, it's raining in outer space, and the bots are sad because they can't go outside and play. Things perk up with the invention exchange. Jonah and the bots debut GIF notes, classic literature summed up in emojis, while the Mads offer punt bunnies, bunnies that live to be kicked. Artie, the Moon 13 maintenance man, notes that a set piece where David Carradine wrestles a tentacle monster has been cut from the MST3K version of today's movie. A shame, Artie notes, as the scene could have saved the whole movie. In segment 2, Jonah and the bots enact the Dark One's Renaissance Bar and Grill franchise tape, providing much-needed training for those who want to open an establishment like David Carradine. Jonah reminds the bots of the wizard-based comedy craze in segment 3, and reads from the You Might Be a Crummy Wizard joke book. Jonah assures the bots that said craze was before their time, but Crow's shocked there were cultural events before his creation. Pearl and her sci-fi era lackeys visit in segment 4. Bobo continues to bond with Max, and Kinga informs her grandma Pearl that she's decided to marry Jonah in a cynical ratings stunt wedding. In the final segment, frowns are turned upside down when Jonah recommends a series of movies to help the bots overcome their bad movie exhaustion from today's experiment. Jonah's belief that nothing heals the pain of a bad movie like a good movie ends the episode on a positive note. But what of the Kinga-Jonah wedding and the weird robot worm Max befriended in the last episode? Sorry, friends, your story arc is in another castle, and those plot threads will just have to be tied up in a future episode.
You did remind me that I did like the punt bunnies.
Oh yeah, the punt bunnies were great. Let's get into that in the episode. Beth, what did you think of Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2?
Diminishing returns, I'm afraid. It's hard for me to say because it was a fun movie, but it didn't quite work with the MST format, I don't think. I think this movie is just a little bit too knowing for a satirical take on it to really work, because you have 2 people trying to be funny at the same time. The movie knows it's a movie, and it's constantly referencing the tropes of the genre in a very winky way. So it's kind of taking itself down from the inside. So you have 2 dismantlings going on here, and I don't think it quite works. That said, the movie is kind of fun. I laughed a couple times, and some of the jokes weren't too bad, but I can see why this was a more difficult one for people to take on, because the last one was a little bit more earnest, and so it was easier to play with the format.
Yeah, I'd say the original Wizards of the Lost Kingdom was definitely more representative of fun 80s sword and sorcery movies. And this is tired and low budget and less fun. You can kind of tell that they had fewer resources. I'd be surprised if this even got a theatrical release, to be honest.
Yeah, the fact that so much was obviously, like, there's so much stock footage, like, so little effort was put into making this, and the fact that the movie itself doesn't seem to be taking itself seriously. It's just like, why are we even doing this?
Yeah.
Like, it's much more fun to take down things that have been built up, you know?
Well, that said, I would totally love to see what Jonah the Bots would do with Deathstalker 2, and perhaps one day we'll get that, which is a out-and-out comedy. Because it's weird. That's the interesting thing about MST3K. Like, there's at least one successful episode where they just riff a comedy, and that's Catalina Caper way back in season 2, which is an episode I really love. And then there's a case where they handled a movie that's kind of a parody, like Alien from LA is very much a goof on the genre, but that's a really successful episode. And yet, at the same time, you have a movie that parodies itself in the form of The Wild World of Batwoman, and that I remember as being one of the least successful episodes of the show. So It's interesting in that perhaps maybe not comedy, but definitely parody is really difficult, and it depends on what the wrong elements are and what they can latch onto as writers. Because, you know, I kind of enjoyed the movie, like not as much as Wizards of the Lost Kingdom. Like I enjoyed the episode more, strangely enough. But as far as movies go, I mean, Wizards of the Lost Kingdom you could watch totally unriffed and it would be loads of fun.
Right.
And Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2, there's fun to be had, but I wouldn't recommend it, and I wouldn't go out of my way to seek it out because so much of it is a penny-pinching slog.
Yeah, I would say that too. Like, there are moments when it seems like it could have been a fun movie, but you just see when they just run out of money and don't care anymore. And that's not fun as a viewer. And I don't think it's even fun to make fun of to some extent. Yeah.
And also you can kind of see what was happening. We were talking about this in our Deathstalker 3 episode where like the genre just doesn't have any earnestness left in it. Like we've gotten to that point. It's the late 80s. The boom has already happened. The boom has gone bust. And there's nothing left to do by people who are contracted to make a sword and sorcery movie, but to mock it, or at least to come up with something interesting to them, because the genre clearly doesn't interest anyone anymore.
Yeah, so I would say for people out there, you know, if you're a dedicated MST fan, it might be fun for you to check this one out to see what they do with a more difficult to riff movie. But this is not one I would suggest to a casual viewer of the show.
Yeah, and this would definitely be a bad first time episode.
Yeah, there's other ones. There's so many other ones.
Yeah.
Well, something that we might want to actually break down a little bit, since this is our third sword and sorcery movie, is the trope of the hero's quest and why it continues to be so popular even in the modern era. So, are you familiar with Joseph Campbell's monomyth?
Yeah, I think that anyone who's ever read a screenwriting book is aware of the call to action and refusal of the call and meeting a mentor and all of that. So I remember all of the basics of it, as well as the Dan Harmon adaptation of it for writing good television. Did you ever see his TV Wheel?
No, that sounds interesting.
Oh, yeah. Not to be confused with the TV Wheel created by Joel Hodgson. But yeah, there's this story wheel that Dan Harmon is obsessed with. Dan Harmon, of course, the creator of Community and Rick and Morty, for those who, I guess, don't spend their lives on the internet like I do. And so he essentially wrote that all great stories, especially for television, where you need to return to the status quo somewhat, are dependent on these steps. So you have a hero is in a place of comfort, but they want something. They strive out to get it. They pay a heavy price for it, but they do get the thing they want. They return to their place of comfort, having changed as characters. And those are basically the 8 steps summarized.
Right, exactly. Of course, the classic example of this would be Lord of the Rings, which is like the modern kind of revisiting of that era. But even something as, ancient as...
Star Wars!
Yes. Thank you. As the Odyssey follows something along these lines, where there's an adventure and character development and a return.
Really, there was a return in CBC's The Odyssey?
Did it ever return, or did it just kind of?
He gets out of a coma in season 2.
Oh, nice.
But he goes back and forth in his coma world in season 3, which was very confusing to a longtime Odyssey fan. I'm afraid to revisit that show, despite its compelling premise of a kid goes into a fantasy world once he falls out of his treehouse and goes into a coma. CanCon, everybody.
Indeed. But we should mention also that there has been some pushback, especially in the last few decades, about how central this monomyth, because Joseph Campbell's claim is like this is basically universal, that every culture has this myth and it's kind of steeped in the human condition to some extent. But I mean, and I think there's something to this, that like it's so broad as to be kind of useless. It's like saying every poem is about death. It doesn't really actually give you much to, it's kind of true if you really broaden the interpretation, but is it that useful to think about individual stories this way?
That said, I always think about death when I heard about that famous poem, "Here I sit brokenhearted, paid a dime and only farted."
Is that actually the version you know?
That's the version that I know, because I was mystified by the idea of a pay toilet, which never existed in Canada, to my knowledge.
The version that I'm familiar with, the third line is "tried to shit, but only farted."
Oh. See, what would be more pleasing would be "tried to shit, but only sharted." So a little came out, but not enough. This has been shit talk.
This is a censored show, guys. And certainly this movie, kind of follows a lot of what we would think of as a classic kind of hero's journey. Tyre leaves home. He has a guide who's Caedmon. He has a series of trials. He deals with some temptresses. What is maybe different is that there is no real return to home. Which I always thought was maybe the best part of The Lord of the Rings, is that Frodo goes home, but he can't stay. He's been too changed. And that's like kind of the tragedy of what happened, is that he's been damaged forever and there is no real return for him. Yeah,
whereas there's always more turnips where Tyre and Caedmon are going. This really feels like the pilot to an unsuccessful series.
Exactly. But one of the weirdest things about this, and it's interesting that the movie had me thinking about this, is how little agency Tyre had over this whole thing. He's just kind of prodded along. Like, the real hero in all of this is Veneer, who's just, it's like he's playing with chess pieces on a board, just telling everybody where to go. And so, but I mean, that's kind of fair. We often think of heroes' journeys as being like Bildung's romans, but that's a very modern idea. A lot of very old quests are just about, a chosen one being kind of led through his fate. Like one of the best examples that's a classic is Jonah and the Whale. He didn't want to do any of that shit, but God made him. So now we know who he is.
I think that a lot of the reasons why this sort of fails to like hit the pleasing story beats of the hero's journey, because that's one of the things that ends up working about, is that those story beats satisfy. I don't know if they satisfy the way that junk food satisfies, but they often tend to make you feel that a story is complete if it hits those notes. And ideally, it's only hitting those notes when you're thinking about them and you're too wrapped up in the storytelling itself to notice. But with Tyre and Caedmon, it just kind of feels like, it feels very episodic, and also feels more like an ensemble movie, largely, I think, to compensate for the fact that Tyre is played by a young and untested actor who does not acquit himself very well in the film.
Yeah, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but he's a TV actor, and it kind of shows. And so he's not maybe the best choice for the lead role, at least at this point in his career. But yeah, it's just a lot of things are just not firing off on the right cylinders here.
Where in the hero's journey does leaking turnips enter into it? That's the real question. That's what I wanted to know the whole time. The hero has 1,000 turnips.
Oh man, and his chosen one, like the reason they know he's the chosen one is he has something drawn in pen under his armpit. Like, it's just a perfect example of just how low budget this whole thing is.
Yeah. I mean, chosen one narratives, I tend to, whenever there's a prophecy of something, I tend to tune out.
Yeah.
That's never a favorite of mine. But aside from mistakes with the casting of what I guess should be our lead with Tyre, I found myself enjoying the movie just because it's like, you know what? At least there's enough sword and sorcery weirdness going on. Like, what's really appealing about the genre is the kind of Star Wars cantina kookiness that you can bring to the proceedings. And like, there's enough, I think, goofiness, both intended and otherwise, to make this easy to swallow. But yeah, as a presentation of the hero's journey and as just a story in general, I mean, what can you remember or take away from Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2?
It has kind of this infernal kind of logic to it. And I'm talking like
Mr. Burns. It's infernal logic.
But in terms of like, you see something familiar starting to build up and then it just constantly breaks down. Like, you start seeing like, okay, I'm starting to see the beats of what's going to happen, and then it just can't sustain itself. So, you see like little hints that this is being structured on a hero's quest, but it just doesn't have the strength of its convictions.
Yeah, this plays less like a hero's journey and more like a road movie.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Sex. Now that I have your attention.
I was going to say that sultry sax is a good way to move into this next topic. Our lead character is a complete horn dog. Yeah,
and yet he has a totally sexy dad bod in the form of Caedmon that he never tries to touch.
Yeah, it's funny when we compare this to our last Wizards of the Lost Kingdom, which also dealt with sex, but in a way that was maybe more palpable.
Yes, because like Simon was far more realistic for a young teen in that he was both intrigued by and afraid of sex, as kind of exemplified with the kiss of the Spider Woman sequence.
Yeah, whereas in this movie, you just have a bunch of scantily clad ladies and Tyre ogles at them. And that's the joke.
For a movie that has very few jokes, it decided to make that one of them.
But it is, like, this isn't coming out of nowhere. This is very much in the vein of a lot of 80s teen sex romps, where a teen's sexual awakening becomes the fodder for, well, let's get him to his sex. That has to happen.
Yeah, it's made like a little bit weird, and I think this is why we're again seeing some resistance to that or fulfilling that here, is because our hero is so young. Like, it wouldn't matter if, the scripted character was in his mid-teens and was played by an adult, but where he is visibly an awkward, squeaky-voiced teen.
Yeah.
It's super uncomfortable, and there's even a reference to that. I remember there's a riff from Jonah where Tyre is about to be seduced, and he pipes in with,
"Let's not think about how creepy everyone would find this if our genders were reversed."
Yeah, and I have to say, like, this is not something that I like to see in movies, because I just don't... I mean, they don't go quite as far as something like Porky's or Animal House, but I just hate the idea of movies encouraging teen boys to get sex however they can. And it plays with that line a little bit. You have these really weird moments where you have, a tabletop dancer wriggling her boobs at all of the local Skeezeballs, and Tyre is like, "Oh, she's so beautiful," like she's a princess. And it's just like, is that really what he's saying? Or is he saying, "I have a boner"?
I think he can say that and still, like, that can still be true to his character, in that he's like totally naive and hasn't seen another woman other than his mom before. Like, that made sense to me as like, oh, this guy has never had experience in real life. So of course he'd be like, oh, she's beautiful, like, to the first woman he sees. And then he immediately goes for Amathea as soon as he sees her.
Yeah. But it's interesting that the movie ends where you see, again, Veneer very clearly like, you two hook up. You two hook up. You guys hook up? Because where they end is that Caedmon and Tyre, go off to have their own adventures together.
Oh, so you think adventures is a euphemism?
Yeah. Well, it's just funny the way, I mean, obviously, our hero is maybe too young to be explicitly paired, especially when you haven't had any age-appropriate actresses around. But I just thought it was an interesting note to end on, where it's just like, all the het couples, you stay here, but, these guys, these unpaired dudes, you go off and keep having adventures on your own.
Yeah, I don't think friend of Mr. Wizard has ever been code for anything, but it is interesting. But I think that goes to the use of a mentor as part of the hero's journey, which Caedmon is that, okay, Tyre is not old enough to be a good wizard, hence all of his chicken gags, and he's not old enough to find a mate. So he still needs to be protected by someone who is assuming the both teacher and father role that he never had.
True. I think it also might speak to the fact that there is something kind of implicitly queer about this genre. I mean, the original Lord of the Rings is very gay. All those little hobbits are just doing it with each other all the time,
Lord of the Rings is very gay is the pull quote that's on my copy of Lord of the Rings.
Like, it's just, in the genre, women tend to be very adjacent. Like, they're not really needed. So it's very much like all these guys go on adventures in the woods together. Like, what do you think is going on?
I don't know. We've got, warrior babes here. They're very much emphasized as babes, but they are still warriors. They are still fighters.
Yeah, and they're dangled around for the audience's titillation, but they don't continue on. Like, they're just kind of like stops in the road, just like you had Arwen and the other one in Lord of the Rings, but they were so sexless,
Yeah, and with Tyre, where it almost makes sense, as I said before, that he would be paired off with Caedmon to develop in a non-sexual way, just because he is underdeveloped, sexually and socially. He needs to have someone to teach him how to be around people because he is painfully awkward. And that doesn't seem to be a mistake on the movie's part. They really seem to be emphasizing that. What with the jokes about him being unable to pronounce the word skewer.
I'll skewer him.
Yeah, like a skewered Frasier.
In a very Freudian way. And that he couldn't find anyone his own age in the movie. I say that like it was a failing on his part. Like this entire movie was a dating site. It's like I tried so hard to make it with Sid Haig and I couldn't.
But the weird thing is the tables get turned at the end, right? Like the protege becomes the mentor. They're very explicit. Like, now that you have beefed up your Popeye arm, you need to take the mentor role in this relationship now and teach Caedmon how to be a good wizard, because he was never actually that good.
Yeah, maybe they'll be on more equal footing in that Tyre will be changing Caedmon's diapers and Caedmon will be informing Tyre how to talk to girls. That's a good trade-off, I think. So, this is, like the last two films we did, a Roger Corman production.
Indeed, and there's a lot of Roger Corman familiar faces here.
Some even behind the camera, because the movie was written and directed by Charles P. Griffith. And not only did he write the very comical scripts for Little Shop of Horrors, the original, and Death Race 2000, both of which had satirical elements in them. But he was the one who wrote Gunslinger, which was riffed earlier in this show back in season 5. And he was the one who did an uncredited rewrite of It Conquered the World, which we covered earlier on this podcast.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
In front of the camera, you have David Carradine, Lana Clarkson, Mel Wells, who is in the aforementioned Little Shop of Horrors, Sid Haig. There's a lot of familiar faces here. He got all of his, bigger star roster together for this very not good movie.
Yes. All the stars are out to shine. If by stars you mean Sid Haig, Lana Clarkson.
Well, they're familiar faces at least. I knew Mel Wells from something.
And honestly, Mel Wells is certainly, I think, one of many interesting figures here. Like, he is, I think, one of the most fun actors in the movie. Like, I really liked Caedmon.
Yeah, I did too. I actually really liked the initial setup of him as being like a bumbling shepherd figure.
What the world needs more is more doofy wizards.
Indeed.
But yeah, like he was not born Mel Wells, but instead Ira Melcher, and had a PhD in psychology, working as a clinical psychologist. But this is just one of the things that he did. Like, he had this very varied career in that he was an actor, he was a DJ, and he would occasionally like write and direct. I would so love to go to a rave with Caedmon on the turntable.
Oh, that was... Can we just mention how bad the wigs are in this movie?
Sure, all wigs are bad.
They're all so saggy looking.
I think that's actually the pull quote for Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2. They're all so saggy looking.
Also, probably the biggest name here is David Carradine, who is very much the Harrison Ford of the Star Wars Christmas special in this movie. Like, he's totally half-assing it.
Oh, I thought you were going to suggest something about substances.
I think that was Carrie Fisher.
It was most definitely Carrie Fisher the most, yes.
But I actually don't... I know him by reputation, but I have not seen him in anything more reputable than this, I have to admit.
Well, David Carradine is best known for a show that was before my time called Kung Fu. And that was his claim to fame for a long time. He did segue into movies, and he was a successful actor. And he was successful in the sense that he never stopped working, which to me is like, you know what, you can have career highs and lows. And he had both throughout his decades of work. But he was always really well known for this show. He's got real chops, and even being somewhat half-assed in this movie, I think he brings a certain kind of ironic swagger to everything. So he's also fun to watch. Like, I enjoyed David Carradine. Like, I'm surprised at how much I enjoyed the performances in this movie, given how bad our ostensible lead is. Mm-hmm. But like, David Carradine knows what kind of movie he is in, keeps his tongue firmly planted in cheek, and has enough presence to pull it off. This is a far cry from when I was first introduced to him, when a somewhat puffier David Carradine was the star of the spin-off from his biggest hit, a Canadian-produced spin-off called Kung Fu: The Legend Continues, in which a relative of his character is in the modern day, but he has a son who's a cop. And because it was about Carradine's character, but Carradine was too old to give a damn about fighting anymore, every episode consisted of, hey, there's a crime going on. Why don't you go stop it while I sit down and do the junior jumble for a while? But that said, like, even though he hit the low point of Kung Fu: The Legend Continues, which is just the worst thing on anyone's resume, like, he did Kill Bill like over a decade later.
True. And
he never stopped working. So even when Kill Bill, the buzz around him died down from that, like 6 years after Kill Bill 2, he returned to the Corman factory for a little movie called Dino Croc vs. Super Gator in 2010. For a lot of listeners, David Carradine is perhaps best known not for his work at all, but for his weird and semi-mysterious death, which later got blamed on autoerotic asphyxiation, which some have said is a conspiracy to cover up a murder. I don't know, because all of the reports that I read when his death had occurred had says like, oh, well, Mr. Carradine was a big fan of bondage and autoerotic asphyxiation, but we swear this is some kind of murder. It always sounds like when someone's trying to cover up a suicide going, no, he was cleaning his gun, which just makes him sound like an idiot. Yeah.
On that note, do you know anything about Lana Clarkson?
I do indeed. So Lana is similarly an actor who met with a tragic end. She was in a few Roger Corman movies, most notably Barbarian Queen, which we'll mention later, and Barbarian Queen 2, which was made not that long after Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2. But she had her kind of heyday in the 80s as a kind of like sword and sorcery B-movie figure. And by the time we get to the 2000s, she's in her 40s. She had just been fired from a play. She had gotten to the point where she was a hostess at the House of Blues, I believe. And she was trying to break in to acting with a self-produced video called Lana Unleashed. And this consisted of her, and I quote, doing impressions of Siegfried Fischbacher of Siegfried and Roy fame, a talking Barbie doll, a Las Vegas showgirl, and Little Richard, for which Clarkson sported blackface.
You had me right to that last one.
Yeah. Unsurprisingly, the only part of Lana Clarkson's video that has survived on YouTube is, of course, the Little Richard part, which I recommend nobody watch. I tried to. But she indeed met with a very tragic end when she met Phil Spector.
No.
Yeah. She showed up at Spector's home and was shot. They tried their best to make it look like a suicide, like Spector didn't even call police when it happened. And again, this is where we get into really weird alibis, because he tried to make it look like a suicide when in fact Spector was notorious for always taking out his gun and threatening people. Like every musician he ever worked with seemed to have a "I was threatened at gunpoint by Phil Spector" story. Like the Ramones talked about that when they wanted to work with Spector their entire career. And yet when it finally happened, it was a nightmare because he always had his damn gun out. So that was ultimately what was his undoing, is that he finally fired it. And that's how Lana Clarkson's life sadly ended. Like she never got back to what little fame that she had. She had been on hard times. And, that we had gotten to the point where like Michael Bay testified in the Lana Clarkson trial because they had encountered each other at a party like the night that she had died. And some accounts say that he didn't even remember her, despite like directing her in a commercial just a little while ago, prior to the death. And it's a very, very tragic story, and it's really sad to see how someone can get so washed up after being, in demand for being an attractive and often nude lead actor, and then when you hit 40, you're no longer welcome.
Gosh. So what happened to Sig Haig? Does he get run over by some Teamsters or what?
No, Sid Haig is a happy ending.
Okay.
Fortunately, we saved the best for last. In that Sid Haig is still working, even though he's 79.
Ah.
He'd worked with Corman before. Like the earliest thing I can think of, and I'm sure there are others, so please write in if you know of other Corman Haig collaborations. But I remember him most from a 1980s Alien ripoff called Galaxy of Terror. If you see one Sid Haig movie, make it Spider Baby, in which he co-stars with Lon Chaney. I would almost describe it as an R-rated Addams Family. That is a great horror comedy, Spider Baby, aka the maddest story ever told. But he's been working forever. Like his earliest credits go to both the 60s Batman and the original Get Smart.
Wow.
Yeah. And even though an actor his age might be put out to pasture, especially one who only achieved fame in B-movie circles anyway, like he has been celebrated by Rob Zombie, who likes to get all of these B-movie actors out of retirement. So he's consistently working because whenever Rob Zombie makes a movie, Sid Haig gets a plum role. So he's still working and happy and seems like a really cool, laid-back dude with a very interesting career.
Hey, everybody, it's time for the Shallow 13.
It's time for Shallow 13. 13 quick incantations to reveal hidden truths about Wizards of the Lost Kingdom 2. Go, Adam, go.
Though staff loved writing riffs for Wizards of the Lost Kingdom, this sequel proved to be more of a slog for the MST3K writers' room. Wizards 2 is the one film from Season 11 that series creator Joel Hodgson regrets picking.
Like the last two sword and sorcery experiments we looked at, Wizards 2 likes to recycle. Recycle footage, that is. You'll find shots from previous Roger Corman productions like The Raven, Sorceress, Deathstalker, Deathstalker 2, and the original Wizards of the Lost Kingdom.
In fact, Jonah and the bots noticed that Amethyst changes clothing abruptly between battle scenes and her scenes with the rest of the cast. That's because any footage of Lana Clarkson in battle was lifted from Barbarian Queen, a 1985 sword and sorcery epic in which Clarkson plays another warrior named Amethyst.
Does teen goofball Tyre look familiar to you? If you watched a lot of TV in the 80s, chances are you've seen him before. Actor Robert Jane was a prolific, if low-level, child actor during that time, playing bit parts in Webster, Kids Incorporated, Knots Landing, T.J. Hooker, Different Strokes, The A-Team, Perfect Strangers, Hill Street Blues, and Small Wonder, among many others.
That said, Robert Jane is probably best known for his role as the obnoxious, weirdly parentless teenager Melvin Plug in the surprise blockbuster hit of 1990, Tremors. He would replay his role in Tremors 3 and the short-lived Tremors TV series in 2003.
Tyre sports a shaggy Prince Valiant haircut, a cut which has often been used to signify royalty in films set in vaguely Middle Ages. Who do you think wore it best? Tyre, Laurence Olivier as Richard III, Mowgli from the Jungle Book, He-Man, Prince Adam? Let us know what you think.
I think it's Emo Phillips. And Jonah and the bots agree with me. As Tyre leaves with Caedmon, we get a number of riffs about Emo Phillips.
Emo Phillips leaves home.
Toodaloo. Wise wizard, please teach me how to run.
Phillips, a one-liner comic with a distinct high-pitched voice, was one of the most popular comedians of the 80s and still tours today. As such, he's been the punchline in both the new season and the earliest episodes of MST3K. I saw him live once, actually, and he was really great.
When Tyre uses a spell to recuperate after killing Sid Haig and his skull starts shining through his head, Jonah quips, "He's regenerating." It's a Doctor Who reference. Whenever the role of the Doctor is recast, the character gets fatally injured or ill. The Doctor's body is then transformed into that of the incoming actor. Inexplicably, clothes and shoes tend to change as well.
The IMDb for this movie notes that both Robert Jane and Mel Wells did their own stunts. What? Crow, however, jokes that the actor playing Caedmon has been replaced by a stuntman. Since the shot seems specifically angled to avoid showing his face when he slides headfirst through a not very high window, we're thinking Crow is right and the IMDb is wrong, if you can believe it.
Caedmon is compared to Captain Lou Albano. Albano was a popular wrestler with a doofy avuncular charm that led to some oddball work outside of the ring, like his appearances in Cyndi Lauper videos and as Super Mario in the Super Mario Bros. Super Show.
Though Albano retired from wrestling in 1969, he achieved notoriety as a ranting heel of a manager for the World Wrestling Federation. In the WWF, Albano was part of a triumvirate of terror alongside two equally notorious managers, Fred Blassie and the Grand Wizard of Wrestling.
The riff, "I picked the wrong week to quit sacrificing to Baal,"
I picked the wrong week to stop sacrificing to Baal,
is a nod to the running gag from the Zucker-Abrams-Zucker comedy Airplane. In that film, Lloyd, "My lungs were aching for air bridges," utters several variations on the same phrase, including, "I picked the wrong day to quit smoking," "I picked the wrong day to quit drinking," "I picked the wrong day to quit sniffing glue."
Jonah and the Bots reference Devo's famous call and response, "Are we not men? We are Devo." This mantra is heard in some versions of their single Jocko Homo and was used as the title of their first album. The phrase, "Are we not men?" originates from the 1933 film Island of Lost Souls, an adaptation of The Island of Dr. Moreau.
And that's time.
So Beth, it is interesting that we end on a reference to Island of Lost Souls, as that unites both Devo and the band that was often compared to Devo, Oingo Boingo, as they released a song called No Spill Blood that quotes from Island of Lost Souls.
Interesting.
Yeah, popular with new wave groups. Island of Lost Souls. Now, you weren't familiar with Oingo Boingo prior to this episode?
No, not a bit.
Oh, wow. So you hadn't even heard Weird Science?
No, not off the top of my head. I mean,
wow.
I've heard the name, but it didn't connect anything immediately. But you were kind enough to share some stuff with me, and I was very intrigued.
Well, one of the reasons why we brought this up is there is a riff referencing the Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo.
The Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo.
Right, that was their original name, though, was the Mystic Knights of Oingo Boingo, right?
Yes, in the 1970s, Oingo Boingo was the Mystic Knights, and they were more of a theatrical troupe that happened to have a lot of musical elements, and that came from Danny Elfman. But the real founder of the Mystic Knights was his brother Richard, who later became a filmmaker, making the one kind of tangible artifact of the Mystic Knights era of Oingo Boingo when they were doing stuff that was closer to cabaret shows and semi-plays, which was a movie called Forbidden Zone. Forbidden Zone, well, you know how Cuphead decided to pay tribute to Flesher Animation by just kind of looking over the whole racism aspect?
Right.
Right. Forbidden Zone pays tribute to 1930s cinema, especially like Fleischer cartoons, but features actors, both white and I believe people of color, in blackface as tribute to those cartoons. It's a strange movie that is not for everybody, but I would also like, if you're up for something that is interesting and wild and creative and tasteless, like a John Waters film, I would recommend Forbidden Zone. But that's the last of that era when they were performing. This was during this time that the Mystic Knights were winners of the Gong Show.
Yeah, I read that. Good for them.
Yeah, I think that was awesome. And they were certainly weird enough with their elaborate props and strange staging and like really unusual compositions from Elfman to, I think, really stick out and make an impression on that show. And when the theater troupe disbanded and Danny Elfman took over and reformed it as more of a, well, it's hard to call it new wave. It's hard to call Oingo Boingo music one thing. But he reformed it as a band, specifically a band focusing on music, and they would abandon the more theatrical stylings that was predominantly the Mystic Knights era. And they had a really strong following in LA, but they could never really break out. They were always like this weird, critically derided band. And they only broke out with the success of their fourth album and the success of a single in particular, Weird Science, which was tied to an Anthony Michael Hall comedy about creating the perfect lady.
Yeah, I do remember that one. Wasn't one of the Coreys in that one?
No, but Robert Downey Jr. is in it.
Oh, okay.
And Bill Paxton is also in it.
All right. Yeah, I hadn't really heard of them, but I really like their early stuff that you said to me very nicely. I think that's my favorite era. The cabaret stuff was really right up my alley. I like the kind of pseudo 30s stuff. Although I agree that can be difficult sometimes, but they really seem to draw a lot of really beautiful ideas out of that time, and I liked how they played with that time. And I was kind of sad to see that when they moved into a different kind of band, they kind of left that behind. Their sound in the 80s and 90s is very of its time, so I was just I could see why they didn't quite break out. Although they did some really interesting things. Like I had a lot of fun listening to them, but I thought when they were Mystic Knights, they were much more interesting.
See, I've enjoyed most periods of things that are labeled Oingo Boingo, whether it's the Mystic Knights or the band. But I definitely have my preference is for their first three albums, which I think are must-haves. The Mystic Knight stuff is interesting and fun, and there's a great clip that is from their final live performance that is from a DVD called Farewell, and that goes through a brief history showing clips of all these really interesting musical compositions and like wild live performances. And Forbidden Zone features this incredible cover of Minnie the Moocher, which has been renamed Squeeze It the Moocher to accommodate a character in that film. There's some great stuff there. Essentially, if you're looking to get involved with Oingo Boingo, and I recommend everybody does, I'd recommend picking up the Farewell DVD, just because that has a sample of like everything they did. And generally speaking, as much as I like, especially those early albums, like I said, Oingo Boingo was much better live.
Right. It seems like one of those bands.
Yeah. And they would play with the structure of their songs and jump around on stage and really create this fun, goofy trick-or-treater Halloween vibe, which is why they would often do shows annually on Halloween on wherever venue they could. Sometimes they would perform in secret, and I guess as a final fun fact, when they wanted to do a secret show for Halloween, they would just book themselves as the Mystic Knights, and that way fans, like deep hardcore fans, were the only ones in the know about it.
What this movie had a lot of was a bunch of fake magic words. A lot of fake Latin spell casting, which by the end of the movie sounded like it was being made up by toddlers. I think Tom says at one point, if you can use Pig Latin for your incantations because it sounds fancier, you might be a crummy wizard. That was Jeff.
Jeff Dunham? No, not Jeff Dunham. Jeff Foxworthy.
Jeff Foxworthy. in case people don't know. But I mean, this is not uncommon. Harry Potter uses a lot of fake Latin spells as well.
Yeah, the only one I know is Expelliarmus, which does something. I'm not really up on my Harry Potter.
To go back to Lord of the Rings, I think Gandalf makes some weird noises at some point in one of Tolkien's made-up languages. So it has a long history.
Yeah, what does "you shall not pass" mean? I mean, what the hell? This is nonsense.
But it's actually funny the history of casting magic spells.
Yeah, I don't like all I know from magic words are their use in television. You know, I think of Simsalabim from Johnny Quest, or I think of Open Sesame, or I think of Mecca Lecca Hi, Mecca Hiney Ho, which was done for Jambi the Genie and Pee Wee Herman getting his wish on Pee Wee's Playhouse.
Yeah, and abracadabra, which is probably the most famous magic word, has a really weird background.
Oh, do tell, Beth. That I didn't know.
People aren't too sure where it comes from, but in a 3rd century book, so very old and still in the Roman Empire, it was a way of treating malaria. Is you would not say but write out the word, and then you would create kind of like a triangle. Every subsequent line, you would take away one of the words. So it'd be abracadabra, abracadabra, until you got down to an A. So you make an upside down triangle, and you'd wear that as a talisman to kind of ward off evil spirits. And now there's different theories about why this particular word, abracadabra, became the idea of something so magical. The suggestion that it comes from phrases in Hebrew that means I will create as I speak, or the Aramaic, I create like the word, or that it's like the Latin and Greek abraxas.
Not to be confused with the Jesse the Body Ventura movie of the same name.
And abraxas stones were worn as amulets, so maybe it was something along those lines. So it was considered like a magical formula, but like actual linguists don't really think that's the case. So it's a little bit unclear about where this all came from, except for the fact that it was written down, and its power was not in the saying of it, but in the writing of it, weirdly enough.
And I mean, abracadabra definitely has power just because it's the one Steve Miller Band song I like.
Yeah, well, Adam, if you were going to have a magical phrase, what would it be?
Well, I looked and I searched all of the magical text that I could, and the one that I found was a Mecca Lecca Hi, Mecca Smiley Ho, which I'm really hoping will cure my depression.
Just say it every day in front of the mirror.
Yeah, I found it from the 7th Habitum of Most Effective Persons.
I was thinking if I was to make up some sort of strange word, because it has to be a word that's not usual, so that you don't accidentally say something magical just in passing to somebody. Like, you don't want to be like, how you doing? It's something that, creates dark forces, because you say that phrase a lot. So I was thinking, considering my background, that I would probably just munch together a whole bunch of character names from Dickens novels.
They all have extremely goofy names, so this is a good choice.
Yeah, like Pumblechook Chokum Child, something like that,
I think that's what David Carradine died of.
It's because I said those words 3 times in a mirror.
And a lemon wedge dropped to the ground.
Well, on that note, Chris, do you have a final factoid for us?
I sure do. Hey, Beth, you recently got a PhD in English, so I'm going to be unfair and ask you this. Do you know who Cadman is?
Cadman?
Isn't it from the Saturday morning series Captain Caedmon and Son?
Well, in addition to being our young hero's mentor in this film, Cadman, the original Cadman, was the earliest named English poet that we know of. He was a cowherd.
You shouldn't call him a coward. That's mean.
And he lived in the 7th century, in the 650s or so. And he was illiterate. But he was still writing poems, apparently. There's one poem that we have some record of. He didn't leave a manuscript or anything, but this one hymn that is attributed to him has been kept around and translated and may or may not survive in a recognizable form from the Middle Ages. It's called Cadman's Hymn, and it's just a little piece that praises God. It's a very important early work in looking at English and Germanic language poetics from the early Middle Ages.
Wow.
I don't know how that got by me.
It's kind of a boring poem as far as I can tell, but, important scholarly and probably meant a lot to the people back then. I don't know what that has to do with our failed wizard.
Well, he's presented as a rustic at first, so maybe the connection's there. He has a goat, doesn't he? Which is kind of like a cow.
Yes. Does he have a goat? I can't remember.
I've already forgotten this movie.
If you've been affected by the issues on this show, if you'd like to share any effective magical incantations, or if you'd like to ask Beth and Adam anything, get in touch with us. Our website is itsjustashow.com, or we're on Twitter at itisjustashow. We'd love to hear from you. It's Just a Show is a podcast from Megaphonic FM. You can find all our fancy little shows over at megaphonic.fm. And thanks again to all of our Patreon supporters. Support It's Just a Show and access some super fan bonus bits, including one where Adam wrestles a tentacle monster. No, that didn't happen. Maybe it did. You'll have to find out by going to itsjustashow.com/Patreon or patreon.com/itsjustashow. And if you want to follow up on anything that was mentioned today, you'll find links in our show notes at itsjustashow.com/episode/32.
Chris, please tell us we're not watching another goddamn wizard movie.
It's a little played out for us now.
Well, I hate to tell you this, but I've heard tell that in the Western Kingdom, an evil wizard is seeding chaos, and we might need to find some young, untested hero who can right these wrongs and maybe seek out treasure and perhaps find love along the way. Will we be successful? Will our hero be successful? Let's find out next time with Season 2, Episode 4, Catalina Caper.
Woo!
Oh, perfect for summer.
Oh my god, everyone sound off your air horns. This is a really fun episode.
I don't remember much from it, but I am looking forward to something that's a little bit more happy. So I do remember this being a very sunny movie.
Mhm.
So yeah, let's do it.
And it's a good transition too, because this is a terrible comedy.
And it's the best kind of terrible comedy. 60s beach, but terrible comedy.
Go Gidget or go home.
This is one of my favorite episodes, one of my top 5.
Ooh.
It's almost like it's my birthday.
Is it Chris's birthday? Find out next time on It's Just a Show.
All right, well, until that sunshiny, happy day.
Remember, if a turnip pees, it's time to flee.
And until next time, Cade on down to It's Just a Show.
See you then. Take it away, Theme Squad.
A mecha like a high, mecha smiley ho.
Pumblechook Chokum Child.